at 31, finally reveals the truth about David family. My biggest pet peeve is lying. I cannot stand it. I never intended to say this out loud, but there are secrets that if kept for too long will kill a marriage before they ever damage a reputation. People look at me and ask, "Why did you break up the family?" No one asks me a simpler question. What happened behind closed doors? Do you know what it feels like to walk into a family where every smile is scripted, every hug has an audience, and every choice you make is watched like a mistake waiting to happen? I loved Brooklyn with all my innocence, believing love was strong enough to overcome fame, power, and unwritten rules. I was wrong. They are really the best people. And I'm so excited Victoria is here tonight. And it means the world to me. Because when love crashes into fame, everyone says they support you until you stop doing what they want. In the next few minutes, I'll tell you about the moments that made me realize something chilling. Sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't an outside enemy, but the silence inside a perfect family. You'll want to stay because there's only one way to answer this question. Go straight into the truth. Brooklyn was like, "Oh, I like this. He has a baby fever, yeah." I remember very clearly. July 2019, London. The first evening I officially stepped into David and Victoria's home as Brooklyn's girlfriend. It wasn't a public debut. No press, no cameras, just a family dinner. Before we walked in, Brooklyn said to me, "Just be yourself." But his voice wasn't confident, and I realized he was hopping for that more than believing it. David was the first to stand up. He shook my hand with that familiar smile the world has seen for decades. He asked where I flew in from, if the trip was tiring, how work had been lately. David had a very pleasant way of speaking, like someone who's been to enough mountaintops to know that silence is sometimes better than showing off. I saw in him a subtle kind of control, the kind that comes from being used to the spotlight without ever needing to remind anyone of it. Victoria was different. She sat across from me, back straight, her eyes more observant than engaged. When Brooklyn introduced me, as she nodded, gave a soft smile and said, "We've heard a lot about you." I didn't know what a lot meant, and I wasn't sure if I should ask. My instincts told me this wasn't the time to be curious. Dinner went by with stories that seemed harmless. David talked about football, about his packed schedule. Victoria talked about fashion, about discipline, about how hard it is to maintain a public image. I listened. When asked, I talked about acting, about how I disliked being labeled a rich girl, about how I wanted to be seen as someone who built her own path. Victoria held my gaze a beat longer when I said that. No disagreement, no approval, just a look. There was one brief moment I remember vividly. Victoria asked Brooklyn, "How long do you plan to stay in the US?" Brooklyn looked at me before answering just for a second, but it was enough to shift the energy in the room. I realized then that even though no one said it, every decision Brooklyn made was no longer just between the two of us. After dinner, as David poured more wine, he asked me gently, "Are you used to being watched?" I answered honestly. I grew up in a family that's also, but I think every house is its own world. David nodded. Victoria said nothing. She just set her glass down softly, but the sound rang louder than any response. That night when we got to our room, Brooklyn apologized to me. I asked, "For what?" He was silent. And it was that silence that chilled me. I started to understand that in this family there are things no one explains, but everyone is expected to understand. The visits that followed weren't louder, but the pressure became clearer. Every time Brooklyn and I talked about the future, where to live, what to do, there was always one name in the air, even if no one said it out loud. The family. I came to see David as the one who maintained balance and Victoria as the one who upheld order, and that order had been in place long before I came along. At the end of 2019, during another gathering, Victoria asked me directly, "Do you think you're ready for this life?" Not marriage, not being a wife, but this life. I knew exactly what she meant. I said I loved Brooklyn. Victoria smiled, but this time the smile didn't reach her eyes. On the way home, Brooklyn said, "My mom's just looking out for me." I didn't disagree, but but inside me a question formed. One I never dared to speak out loud. If a mother loves her son so much that she leaves no room for anyone else, then where does that leave the woman who comes after? I still love Brooklyn. I still believe in our love. But from that moment on, I understood that the upcoming wedding wasn't just about two young people in love. It was an event, a symbol, and possibly a test of power. And I wasn't just preparing to be a bride. I was stepping into a family where love always comes with conditions, and every misstep has a price. I don't know yet where the tragedy begins, but one thing I know for sure. From that very first evening, I was no longer an outsider and never truly on the inside. April 2022, Palm Beach, Florida, just 3 days before the wedding. I was standing in the fitting room, light pouring straight down from the ceiling, the dress hanging in front of me. Brooklyn sat on the sofa, eyes glued to his phone. When the door opened, I knew right away this wasn't just a casual visit. Victoria walked in with her assistant. No rush, no tension, but her eyes said everything. She looked at the dress, then at me. "Are you sure about this choice?" she asked, her voice so calm that I didn't know whether to defend myself or explain. I answered directly, "I've already made my choice." The air in the room shifted instantly. Brooklyn looked up. He glanced at his mom, then at me. Victoria was silent for a few seconds, then continued, still gently. "I just think that day is very important. There are traditions." I heard what she didn't say, "Not my traditions." I replied, "This is Brooklyn's and my wedding day." Brooklyn cut in. His voice rushed. "Mom, we already agreed on this." Victoria turned to him. "I'm speaking with." She didn't raise her voice, but it was enough for me to understand. Roles were being redrawn right in front of me. That evening during the family dinner, David sat at the head of the table. He didn't join the debate, but he watched closely. When the wedding schedule came up, I mentioned I wanted to keep the first dance private, just between Brooklyn and me. David nodded, but Victoria gently set down her knife and fork and said, "Family is always at the heart of moments like this." I answered, this time without backing down. "I agree, but the family I'm building is with Brooklyn." No one said anything after that. Brooklyn looked down. David sipped his wine, but I could feel it. I had just crossed a line. On the day of the wedding rehearsal, the tension was no longer beneath the surface. When the band was rehearsing, there was confusion about the order of the dances. The host asked for clarification. Victoria stepped onto the stage and said a few things to the band. I stood below waiting. Brooklyn was beside me, his hand tight in mine. I stepped forward and said clearly, "This part is for Brooklyn and me." Victoria turned to me, looked straight at me, and said in front of everyone, "We're just trying to make everything perfect." I replied, "Perfect for who?" No one clapped. No one smiled. That's when David finally spoke, his voice deep and slow. "All right, let's stick to your plan." Victoria didn't argue, but I could clearly see the coldness in her eyes. That night, Brooklyn and I had our first argument since the engagement. It wasn't about the dress. It wasn't about the dance. It was about how he didn't stand up for me in that moment. Brooklyn said he felt caught in the middle. I told him I didn't want to become his battlefield. He went silent, and that silence scared me more than any words. The wedding day unfolded under the Florida sun. Hundreds of guests, celebrities, athletes, friends, family, cameras everywhere. I walked down the aisle hearing whispers, seeing the glances. People looked at the dress. People looked at both families. People looked to see who was in control of the space. Throughout the ceremony, I smiled, but I constantly felt myself being pulled out of the center by the smallest of details. A placement, the speaking order, a shortened moment. Brooklyn held my hand more than usual. David remained the mediator. Victoria kept her distance, not far, but far enough for me to feel the boundary. After the reception, when guests started leaving, I stood alone in the dressing room. Brooklyn came in, hugged me, and said he was sorry. I asked him, "What are you sorry for?" He couldn't answer. And in that moment, I realized the wedding hadn't resolved anything. It only exposed the tensions that had been there all along. I didn't walk out of that ceremony feeling like I'd begun a marriage. I walked out feeling like I had officially stepped into a long tug of war where love, family, and power would never be on the same side. And that's when I understood the cracks had already formed. Small, subtle, but deep enough that, if not faced, they'd tear everything apart in the years to come. After the wedding, we left Florida and returned to Los Angeles, carrying with us a strange feeling. Not the joy of newlyweds, but the exhaustion of two people who had just come out of a trial where no one declared a winner. In the early days, Brooklyn tried to create a sense of. He cooked, played music, talked about future plans as if moving to a different city would somehow fix everything. But I quickly realized that even though we were married, the family was still present in every smallest decision of our married life. Brooklyn's phone was never silent for long. Calls from London, texts answered immediately, conversations I couldn't hear clearly but I could feel the pressure. Some nights we'd be having dinner and he'd step out to the balcony to take a call. When he came back, he was quiet. I'd ask what was going on and he'd say it was nothing important. But if it wasn't important, why was his face so tense? Our first disagreements didn't explode into yelling. They started with the smallest questions. I asked Brooklyn if we could decide our schedule ourselves, choose where to live, build a life on our own terms. He said his family was just concerned about him. I asked, at what point does concern become control? He didn't answer. And I realized that for Brooklyn, the line between worry and control had been erased a long time ago. When I began taking on my own projects, the tension increased. No one told me I couldn't work. No one openly objected. But I could feel the discomfort in indirect conversations. Someone would say Brooklyn should be more stable. Someone else would remind us that the family image was very important. I began to feel like I had been cast in a very specific role. The wife who wasn't supposed to disrupt the order that had existed for decades. We had our first real fight at the end of 2022. Not about money, not about work, but about a trip to London. Brooklyn wanted to go alone. I asked why I couldn't come with him. He said it was a family matter. I asked, then what am I? The room was silent for a long time, and it was that silence that made me realize, in the most important moments, I was still seen as an outsider. I started to doubt myself. Was I asking for too much? Did I not understand his family's culture? But every time I tried to step back to be more accommodating, I felt myself disappearing a little more. I stopped speaking my full mind. I stayed quiet during video calls with his family. I began editing my words, my expressions, my tone. And that's when I realized I was living in a marriage where peace came at the cost of one person becoming smaller. Brooklyn was stuck in the middle and it tore him apart. Some nights he'd tell me he was tired, that he just wanted everyone to get along. I looked at him and wondered, how do we get along if the cost is always me? I didn't need him to cut ties with his family. I just needed him to stand by me when it mattered. But every time I needed him, he was pulled elsewhere. Not by commands, but by a kind of invisible power only iconic families possess. Doubts began to creep in. Not doubts about physical fidelity, but emotional loyalty. I started to wonder when Brooklyn chose silence around his family, was he betraying me? When he said, let's talk later, take it slow, don't make it a big deal. I felt like I was no longer a priority, and that feeling kills a marriage faster than any scandal ever could. The media pressure made everything worse. Every article, every comment became fuel for new arguments. Brooklyn told me not to read them. I said I couldn't help it when my name was being picked apart every day. He said it was the price of fame. I said I didn't marry him to become someone else's price. Our arguments became more intense, not because we used harsh words, but because we both knew we were losing something important. Talks of children began to surface, and that's when everything got more serious. I asked Brooklyn how we'd raise our kids, where they'd live, what values we'd follow. He said we'd figure it out later, but to me, that wasn't a distant future question. It was a question of power. I was afraid that if we had kids, I wouldn't just be fighting for my place, I'd be fighting for theirs too. That fear kept me up many nights. Once during a video call with his family, someone joked, "The kid has to grow up the right way." Everyone laughed. I didn't. I looked at Brooklyn. He avoided my eyes. In that moment, I knew I was standing at a crossroads. Either stay silent and lose myself or face the truth that our love was being crushed under expectations no one ever dared to speak aloud. Our marriage didn't collapse overnight. It cracked little by little. Through each call, each moment, Brooklyn chose peace over standing with me. I don't hate him. I see that he's also a victim. But I started to understand that in this battle, there wasn't room for both of us to win. And when a marriage forces you to choose between love and your own existence, it's no longer a marriage. I started to wonder, if I stay, who will I become in 5 years, 10 years? A perfect wife in public, but hollow inside. A name mentioned only as Brooklyn's wife. No longer. That question haunted me so deeply. I knew sooner or later I'd have to do the one thing no one in his family wanted. I would no longer stay silent. And that was when the decisions I'd been avoiding started to take shape quietly without announcement. But clear enough for me to know the real storm of this marriage hadn't even begun. Early 2023, Los Angeles. We had been married for almost a year. On the outside, everything still looked fine. The occasional photo of Brooklyn and me appearing together was shared with just the right amount of smiles. But on the inside, our marriage had entered a different phase, one where every decision felt like a family political move. Brooklyn began turning down some of his family's events quietly. No announcements, just busy, couldn't make the flight. Next time, I knew those refusals didn't come from indifference. They came from exhaustion. And each time his phone buzzed more than usual. Long calls, messages read and deleted. I asked what was going on. He said it was just a misunderstanding. March 2023, London. We flew back for a family occasion. The moment we stepped into that familiar house, I could feel the shift. No one was visibly angry, but the air was thick, as if everyone was waiting for the right moment to say something that had been bottled up too long. Victoria greeted me, polite as always. David shook Brooklyn's hand, but his eyes were heavier than usual. That dinner didn't last long. The conversation circled around work, schedules, public image. When I offered the idea that we wanted to plan our own time, Victoria looked directly at me and said, "This time without sugarcoating. When my son shows up, he doesn't just represent himself." I replied just as directly, "And when your son got married, he no longer belonged only to his old family." The room fell completely silent. David spoke up, his voice low, trying to. "We're talking about very sensitive matters." But it was too late. The sensitive things had finally been named. After dinner, Brooklyn spoke privately with his parents. I stood outside listening to voices behind a half-closed door. There was no yelling, but the words were short, firm. When Brooklyn stepped out, his face was pale. He said, "I can't please everyone." I replied, "I don't need you to please anyone. I need you to choose." He looked at me for a long time, and his silence was the most painful answer of all. Summer 2023, the distance began to show publicly. Brooklyn was absent from important family events. The press started asking questions. Words like rift, estranged, and sources close to the family began appearing more frequently. Brooklyn and I fought more often, not because of the headlines, but because they reflected the truth we were both trying to avoid. One night in Los Angeles, we argued until we were emotionally drained. I told him I couldn't keep living with the constant need to prove I wasn't a threat to his family. Brooklyn said he couldn't turn his back on his parents. I asked, "What about me?" He said, "I'm trying." But to me, trying without choosing was no longer enough. By the end of 2023, at a public event, Brooklyn didn't appear with his family. Cameras caught the absence. The next day, the headlines exploded. I read every word, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I was just tired, because what they called rumors were really the result of a war that had been quietly raging for too long. Victoria didn't call me. David didn't either. This silence was different. It was final. Brooklyn got a long call from London. After he hung up, he sat beside me and said, "They think you're pulling me away from the family." I looked at him and asked, "What do you think?" He didn't answer right away. and that hesitation to me was more brutal than any accusation. By now, our arguments weren't indirect. They were direct, painful, and always came back to the same question. Is our love strong enough to survive when it's forced to stand against a powerful family? Brooklyn said he loved me. I believed that. But I also saw that he was being torn in two, and each time he tried to hold both sides, he lost a part of himself. The moment I realized we had reached the edge was when Brooklyn, in complete exhaustion, said, "I just want everyone to stop." I asked, "Stop what?" he said, "So I can breathe." And I realized in this marriage we were both suffocating. The only difference was I had nowhere left to step back. In the days that followed, we lived next to each other but felt more distant than ever, each of us carrying a different fear. I was afraid of disappearing into a structure that wasn't built for me. Brooklyn was afraid of losing his family. And between those two fears, our marriage was being crushed piece by piece in full view of the world. By the end of 2023, I knew this fight was no longer private. It had become a public story even though no one had planned it. And in public stories, someone always gets labeled the troublemaker. This time that someone was me. But the most painful part wasn't the public gaze. It was the moment I realized the man I loved no longer had the strength to stand in the middle. And when he couldn't stand there anymore, someone would have to leave. I didn't leave in that moment, but I knew with absolute clarity we had reached the edge. And if the fall came, it wouldn't be soft. February 2024, Los Angeles. It all began with a short phone call from David. He didn't beat around the bush. No apologies, just we need to talk, all of us. I looked at Brooklyn. He nodded slowly like he'd been waiting for this call for a long time. The meeting took place in a quiet house in Beverly Hills. No press, no assistants, no one else. Just the four of us. David, Victoria, Brooklyn, and me. The energy was different from the start. Not the kind of tension that explodes, but the weariness of people who have gone too far to return to where they began. David sat across from us, hands clasped. Victoria sat beside him, back straight, her eyes locked on me. Brooklyn sat in the middle as always, but this time he didn't look down. David was the first to speak. He talked about family, about the years spent building their image, about how every choice was made to protect their children. I listened. When he stopped, I said slowly, "I understand what protection means, but protecting someone shouldn't mean taking away another person's right to exist." Victoria frowned. She immediately replied, "No one's taken anything from you." I looked straight at her and said, "Then why do I always have to ask for permission when it comes to decisions about my own husband?" The room tightened. Brooklyn took a deep breath. For the first time, he interrupted his mother. "Mom, I'm 26 years old." Victoria turned to him. "I know, but you're still my son." Brooklyn replied, voice shaky but firm, "And I'm his husband." That sentence landed like a weight. I saw his hand clench. I knew how much that line had cost him. The conversation lasted for hours. No shouting, but words that hit where it hurt. I spoke about the dinners where I wasn't consulted, about the trips I wasn't told about the feeling of being treated like a disruption, not a person. Victoria pushed back, saying she just wanted to keep the family close. I asked, "Close? How? If anyone who enters has to shrink themselves to fit." David tried to bring things back to center. "We all love Brooklyn," I nodded. "I don't doubt that, but every kind of love needs boundaries." There was a moment when Victoria fell completely silent. Then she said, stripped of her usual composure, "You don't understand what this family had to give up to get here." I answered, "I didn't come to tear down what you built. I came to build my part of it." Those two sentences hung in the air, undeniable, unmovable. Brooklyn stood up. For the first time, he didn't apologize to anyone. "I love both sides," he said, "but I can't keep living like my marriage is a project waiting for approval." David looked at his son for a long time. He didn't scold him, he just said, "You know there will be consequences." Brooklyn nodded. "I know." After the meeting, there were no hugs, no promises, just the truth laid bare. Brooklyn and I left in silence. In the car, he said, "I don't know where all this is going." I replied, "I just need to know where you stand." He held my hand than ever, but I could still feel the fear in that grip. The weeks that followed were the hardest. His family didn't reach out as often. The media kept speculating. Brooklyn grew quieter. I knew he was paying the price for his choice, and it made me feel both grateful and guilty. We started talking about the future differently, more realistically, with less illusion. I told him I couldn't live in a state of waiting for approval. He told me he couldn't fully turn his back on his family. Those two truths collided like walls. April 2024, a major family gathering took place in London. Brooklyn didn't attend. This time there was no excuse. He simply said, "I'm not ready. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel victorious. I just saw clearly. Every step forward we took came at the cost of something else falling behind." One night we sat on the living room floor, no lights on, just the glow from the street outside. Brooklyn said he was afraid of disappointing me. I said I was afraid of losing him. We both laughed, a tired, worn-out laugh. I realized then that in this marriage there were no villains, just people who loved in different ways and a family structure too big to bend. That conversation didn't fix everything, but it changed something important. We stopped pretending. I no longer stayed silent for the sake of peace. Brooklyn no longer apologized without knowing why, and his family, whether they agreed or not, had finally heard us speak. By the time May arrived, I knew one door had closed and another had opened. Not a door to perfect reconciliation, but to hard decisions. I understood that from here on, every choice would come with a cost, and the question was no longer who's right or wrong, but what we're willing to pay for. The conversation in Beverly Hills didn't save everything, but it ended the long silence. And when silence ends, what remains must come into the light, no matter how painful. After everything, the strangest thing is, I no longer want to win. I don't want to be right. I don't want to explain. I just want to breathe. And I know Brooklyn does too. When you've lived through enough days of being watched, questioned, labeled, you begin to understand. There are battles that if you keep fighting, you might win online but lose in your own marriage. So we chose silence, not out of fear, but to protect the parts of ourselves that were still whole. Let me be honest with you. After all the storms, my life with Brooklyn is not a fairy tale. There's no soundtrack, no glamorous lighting. Just real mornings where I wake up and hear him in the kitchen for coffee, then turning to me like he's asking, "Are you okay today?" That's all. But to me, that's what we were missing most before. A peace that doesn't need to be proven. We spend most of our time in Los Angeles. It's easier to breathe here, not because we're avoiding anyone, but because here we're not pulled into a family schedule that runs like a machine. Here, I can wear a t-shirt, throw my hair up, and walk out the door without preparing myself for the gaze of the world. Here, Brooklyn doesn't walk like he's inside a museum called. He's just my husband and I'm just his wife. Brooklyn works in his own way. Food projects, meals, he experiments with things that make him feel valuable without needing anyone's approval. I understand that feeling better than anyone. There was a time when he tried too hard to prove he was worthy, and that kind of pressure slowly kills a man. I saw it in his eyes, the feeling of being forced to become the version others expect. I don't want Brooklyn to live like that. I want him to live as himself. As for me, I work, but I'm selective. I don't chase visibility. I no longer feel the need to speak up every time my name trends online. Some days I read the comments and just laugh. People talk about me like they live in my house. They accuse me like they've sat with me through those silent dinners. One day I'm the villain, the next day I'm the victim. I look at all of it and realize if I keep living in reaction to them, I won't be living for Brooklyn anymore. But the hardest part isn't the public. The hardest part is the family. I didn't cut off Brooklyn's family. I never wanted to steal him from anyone. I just understood one thing. If I kept trying to be the perfect daughter-in-law by someone else's standards, I would disappear. And at one point, I almost did. Now, my relationship with his family isn't the warm and cozy kind people want to see in photos. It's something else. Distance maintained so we don't hurt each other further. There are times I've wanted to send long texts to explain, to say that I'm not the enemy. But I stopped myself because I know in families built on pride and spotlight, explanations aren't always bridges. Sometimes they're sparks. I chose a different way. I show respect. I don't speak badly. I don't throw shade. I don't use the media as a weapon. I just hold my boundaries. And you know what? Boundaries are what make people angriest, because they say, you're no longer under anyone's control about Brooklyn's siblings. I'll be fair. People love the narrative of the whole family hates me, but real life isn't that. Brooklyn still loves his brothers and they still love him. Romeo and have had their moments of closeness and distance, but family is still family. The issue is when your family is a public symbol, every relationship gets pulled into the image. You're no longer allowed to love your own way. You have to love the way the public thinks is beautiful. I hate that. I hate that even family affection has to be performed. There was a moment I saw Brooklyn sit silently after a call with his family. He didn't cry. He just sat still. And I understood his pain wasn't from being hated. His pain was from always having to choose wife or family, when all he wanted was for both to exist together. I once told him something I'll never forget. I'm not asking you to walk away from anyone. I just don't want you to walk away from yourself. That's our real vow. With Harper, the youngest, I stay as gentle as I can. I don't want any child growing up feeling like they have to pick a side. I don't want Harper to ever carry the question, so who's right? Kids don't need right or wrong. Kids need peace. As for how I feel about Brooklyn after everything, the truth is I love him even more than when we first got married. Because newlywed love always has lights and the thrill of the wind. But love after the storm is something else. It's a choice you make again and again, even on the days that don't feel good. I love Brooklyn not because of the. I love him because when I'm with him, I see a real man. Sometimes vulnerable, sometimes confused, sometimes scared, but always trying to stand up and protect the little family we've built. And Brooklyn loves me in a way that makes it impossible for me to fake it. He doesn't love me as an image. He loves me as a person. Sometimes tough, sometimes tired, sometimes overly sensitive. He doesn't need me to be adorable to be loved. He just asks, "Are you okay?" People ask, "So, after all this, are you too happy?" I'll answer it like this. We're not happy in the fairy tale way. We're happy in the way that says we finally get to live honestly. We have our own home, our own rhythm, our own meals, our own little getaways just to breathe, our own quiet evenings where we don't have to speak and we're not afraid of the silence. We still remember, we still ache, we still feel guilty sometimes, but we no longer let those feelings pull us apart. After the storm, I don't need the world to say I was right. I just need Brooklyn to turn to me, take my hand and say, "Let's go home." Because now home isn't a last name, it isn't a brand, it isn't a standard. Home is a man who chose to stay. And I chose to stay too, not to fight anyone but to protect the love I paid a price to keep. If you ask me what I've learned from all of this, the answer isn't how to handle public opinion. It's not how to live with a famous family either. What I've truly learned is how to choose myself without becoming selfish. I used to think love meant enduring, that if I stayed silent long enough, softened myself enough, humbled myself enough, everything would be okay. But the truth is, you can sacrifice to save a relationship, but you can't disappear to keep it alive. When you no longer have a voice, no longer have boundaries, love turns into a closed room, and you're the one who runs out of air first. I'm not telling this story to place blame. I'm sharing it because I believe there are so many people out there in the same position I was, caught between family, marriage, and the gaze of others, trying so hard to be the good one for everyone, only to forget who you are. I don't want you to choose war. I just hope you choose truth with yourself. My marriage isn't perfect. My family isn't perfect. But what changed everything was the moment Brooklyn, and I looked at each other and agreed on one thing. We won't live to please the world. We'll live in a way that doesn't betray each other and doesn't betray ourselves. If you've made it this far, maybe you're carrying a question deep inside that you haven't dared to say out loud. Say it, at least to yourself. Because staying silent for too long doesn't make you noble. It just makes you tired. Before I go, I want to ask you something and feel free to answer in the comments. In your own family, have you ever had to choose between being loved and being yourself?